The miller, his son, and their donkey, a lesson in pleasing everyone. Chapter 1. The journey begins. The sun rose gently over the quiet village, casting golden hues over the fields and cobblestone paths. The miller, a man of simple wisdom and kind eyes, stood at the doorway of his modest home. His young son, eager and full of energy, bustled about preparing for their trip. Their donkey, a sturdy and reliable companion, stood patiently by the gate, its large ears twitching at the soft morning breeze. The miller and his son were embarking on an important journey to the marketplace in the bustling town several miles away. The plan was straightforward: to sell the donkey, a prized possession, for a fair price. The family had fallen on hard times, and the money from the sale would go a long way in ensuring they had enough food and other necessities for the coming months. Though it was a bittersweet decision to part with the animal that had been a faithful helper, the miller knew it was the right thing to do. The boy was excited about the adventure, seeing it as an opportunity to explore the wider world beyond their small village. He had only heard stories about the market, a lively place full of colorful stalls, loud haggling, and fascinating goods from faraway lands. The miller, however, carried the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, knowing how much rested on this sale. He tightened the simple rope that served as the donkey's lead and called to his son, "Come now, it's time to go." As the trio set out, the air was filled with the gentle sound of birds chirping and the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. The road ahead was long and winding, but the scenery was beautiful. Rolling hills stretched into the horizon, dotted with patches of wildflowers and grazing sheep. Villagers were already out and about, tending to their fields, gathering water from the well, or simply enjoying the early morning calm. The journey began with light-hearted chatter between father and son. The boy asked questions about the market, the people they might meet, and whether they could buy something small as a treat after selling the donkey. The miller, smiling, indulged his son's curiosity but gently reminded him that they needed to focus on their goal. As they made their way down the road, they passed a group of villagers heading in the opposite direction. The group paused, their chatter slowing as they took in the sight of the miller, his son, and the donkey walking together. One man, dressed in a dusty tunic, furrowed his brow and muttered loud enough to be heard, "Well, isn't this a curious sight? A donkey walking freely while two people, clearly tired, trudge alongside. What foolishness!" Another villager chimed in, "What's the point of having a donkey if you're not going to ride it? It's strong enough to carry one of you." The miller stopped in his tracks, startled by the comments. His son glanced at him nervously, unsure of how to respond. The miller scratched his beard thoughtfully, feeling a twinge of embarrassment. He looked at the donkey, standing there as calm and indifferent as ever, then turned to his son. "Perhaps they're right," he said with a sigh. "It does seem silly for us to walk while the donkey has nothing to do." The boy nodded, trusting his father's judgment. "You should ride, father," he said earnestly. "You'll need your strength for the market." Touched by his son's thoughtfulness, the miller smiled and gently patted his shoulder. "Thank you, my boy. Let's do that." He climbed onto the donkey's back with practiced ease, settling into a comfortable position. The boy, now walking beside the donkey, held the rope tightly to guide the animal along the road. They continued on their way, the rhythm of the donkey's hooves providing a steady backdrop to their journey. At first, the arrangement seemed ideal. The boy was young and full of energy, while the miller, though not old, was beginning to feel the effects of years of hard work at the mill. Riding the donkey allowed him to conserve his strength for the challenges ahead. But as they progressed, the father couldn't help but notice the curious stares of others they passed. Some smiled politely, while others whispered to each other, their expressions ranging from amused to judgmental. The boy, too, began to feel the weight of those glances. He didn't say anything, but his steps grew a little heavier, and his grip on the rope tightened. The miller tried to brush off the lingering unease. "People always have their opinions," he muttered to himself. "It's impossible to please everyone." Still, the seed of doubt had been planted, and he couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps their decision would come under further scrutiny. The journey was far from over, and already, the miller began to sense that the road ahead would be filled not just with miles to walk, but with choices to make, choices that would invite endless commentary from those they encountered. For now, though, they pressed on, the market still a distant destination on the horizon. Chapter 2: The Sun Rides. The sun climbed higher into the sky, its golden rays warming the winding path as the miller and his son continued their journey. The boy, now leading the donkey while his father rode, walked with a determined step. Despite the uneven road, he held onto the rope tightly, guiding the animal with care. The miller, perched on the donkey's back, tried to maintain a sense of dignity, though the earlier comments from the villagers lingered in his mind like an irritating buzz. As they turned a bend, the familiar clamor of a caravan reached their ears. Ahead, a group of merchants approached, their wagons laden with goods, barrels of ale, sacks of grain, and colorful bolts of cloth. The merchants were boisterous, their laughter and chatter filling the air as they led their horses and mules. The miller and his son stepped aside to let the caravan pass, hoping to avoid the merchants' attention. But the donkey's braying caught their notice. One of the merchants, a stout man with a booming voice, glanced at the scene and stopped in his tracks. "Well, now, isn't this a sight?" he bellowed, his voice dripping with mockery. The rest of the group turned their heads, curious about the commotion. Another merchant, a wiry man with a sharp tongue, pointed at the miller and said, "What kind of father are you, riding the donkey while your boy trudges along in the dirt? Shame on you." The miller felt his face flush with embarrassment. He opened his mouth to explain, but was interrupted by another merchant. "A child's legs are tender, not meant for long journeys. Yet here you are, letting him tire himself while you sit comfortably. Some example you set." The merchants, their judgment spilling out like a burst dam, didn't wait for a response. They shook their heads in disapproval, muttering amongst themselves as they moved on. The sound of their condemnation lingered in the air, leaving the miller and his son in an awkward silence. The boy tugged at his father's sleeve, his eyes filled with concern. "Father, maybe I should ride instead." "They have a point, you've worked so hard already. I can walk a little farther without getting tired." The miller looked at his son, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. He admired the boy's selflessness, but couldn't ignore the sting of the merchant's words. "Very well, my boy," he said finally, sliding off the donkey. "Let's switch places. You ride, and I'll walk." The son climbed onto the donkey's back, his youthful frame fitting comfortably on the animal. He smiled, eager to help, while the miller adjusted the rope in his hands and began walking ahead. For a while, the change seemed to work well. The boy enjoyed the ride, his laughter echoing as he pointed out birds and wildflowers along the way. The miller, despite the ache in his legs, felt a measure of relief. Perhaps now, he thought, we'll avoid more criticism. But the peace was short-lived. Not far down the road, they encountered another group of travelers, a small family of 4, accompanied by a pair of mules loaded with goods. The mother, a sharp-eyed woman, stopped abruptly as she noticed the pair. She frowned deeply, her gaze fixed on the boy sitting atop the donkey. "Look at this," she exclaimed, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Such disrespect! The boy rides like a prince while his poor father walks. What has the world come to?" The miller stopped, startled by her harsh tone. Before he could respond, the father of the family chimed in, shaking his head. "It's disgraceful, truly. In our time, children respected their elders. No good can come from this sort of upbringing." Even the children of the family joined in. One of them, a girl no older than 10, whispered to her brother, "Why is the boy on the donkey? Shouldn't the father be the one riding?" Her brother nodded solemnly, as though the sight before them was some great moral failing. The miller sighed deeply, his weariness not just physical, but emotional. He glanced at his son, who now looked troubled, shifting uncomfortably on the donkey's back. The boy's earlier joy had vanished, replaced by guilt and uncertainty. "Come down, my boy," the miller said gently, reaching up to help him off the donkey. "It seems no matter what we do, someone will find fault with it." "But father," the boy protested, his voice small, "I didn't mean to upset anyone. I just wanted to make it easier for you." "I know," the miller said with a kind smile, ruffling his son's hair. "And you did nothing wrong. But it seems that trying to satisfy everyone is a fool's errand." The two stood there for a moment, unsure of their next move. The donkey, blissfully unaware of the human drama unfolding around it, flicked its tail and grazed lazily on a patch of grass. The miller took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Let's keep going," he said. "We'll figure it out as we go." And so, they continued their journey, each step weighed down not just by the miles ahead, but by the realization that no matter their choice, criticism was inevitable. For now, the donkey walked untethered, the miller and his son side by side, wondering what new judgment the road would bring next. Chapter 3: Both Ride the Donkey. The day grew warmer as the miller and his son pressed onward. With each step, the road seemed to stretch endlessly, winding through hills and valleys that tested their resolve. The miller's feet ached from walking, and the boy's youthful energy had begun to wane. They trudged silently for a while, the earlier criticisms from strangers weighing heavily on their minds. The miller glanced at his son, noticing the fatigue in his small frame. He wiped the sweat from his own brow and let out a long sigh. "Perhaps we've been making this harder than it needs to be," he said thoughtfully. "What do you mean, father?" the boy asked, his voice tinged with curiosity and concern. The miller patted the donkey's neck. "Why not ride together? The donkey is strong, and the journey will be much easier for us both. Surely no one could fault us for that." The boy hesitated, but then nodded. "If you think it's best, father." With some effort, the miller hoisted his son onto the donkey's back and climbed up behind him. The animal shifted slightly under the added weight, but seemed otherwise unfazed. settled into place, father and son felt a surge of relief as the burden of walking was lifted from their weary legs. For a while, their spirits brightened. Riding together brought a sense of camaraderie, and the road seemed less daunting. The boy leaned against his father, pointing out distant hills and trees swaying in the gentle breeze. The miller, feeling a rare moment of lightness, even hummed a tune he used to sing during harvest season. However, their newfound comfort was short-lived. As they approached a stone bridge spanning a shallow river, the peaceful atmosphere shattered with the angry cries of a farmer tending his field nearby. The man leaned on his hoe, his face flushed with outrage. "You cruel, thoughtless people," he bellowed, his voice carrying across the water. The miller, startled, pulled the donkey to a stop. "What's the matter, good sir?" he called back, unsure of what they had done to provoke such ire. "What's the matter?" the farmer repeated, his voice dripping with scorn. "Look at that poor animal, struggling under the weight of 2 grown humans. Have you no heart? No compassion? That donkey isn't your beast of burden, it's a living creature. Shame on you for overloading it so." The miller looked down at the donkey, which now stood still, its large brown eyes blinking serenely. To him, the animal seemed fine, but the farmer's words struck a nerve. The boy, too, glanced at the donkey with a guilty expression. "Father," the boy whispered, "maybe we are being unfair to the donkey. It's been so good to us, and we shouldn't make it suffer." The miller sighed deeply, dismounting and helping his son to the ground. "You're right," he said, though his frustration was evident. "The last thing I want is to be cruel." He led the donkey off the bridge, away from the shouting farmer, and paused to think. The criticisms they had faced since the start of their journey replayed in his mind. No matter what choice they made, someone had found fault with it. Finally, the miller straightened up with a determined expression. "If riding the donkey is unkind, then we won't ride it," he declared. "We'll carry it instead. This way, no one can accuse us of mistreating the animal." The boy's eyes widened in surprise. "Carry the donkey? But father, it's so heavy." "Not as heavy as the weight of everyone's judgment," the miller replied with a weary smile. "Come, let's lift it together." With great effort, the miller and his son hoisted the donkey, one supporting its front legs and the other its hind legs. The animal, startled by the sudden change, brayed loudly but otherwise stayed still. Slowly, they began to walk, their steps unsteady under the donkey's considerable weight. The scene was absurd, to say the least. The miller and his son staggered forward, sweat dripping from their brows as they struggled to balance the donkey between them. The animal's ears flopped lazily, and its tail swished as if nothing unusual was happening. As they neared a small cluster of houses by the river, people began to emerge, drawn by the bizarre sight. Laughter erupted from the gathering crowd, the sound growing louder with every step the miller and his son took. "What on earth are they doing?" a woman asked, clutching her sides as she laughed uncontrollably. "Have they gone mad?" another man exclaimed, shaking his head in disbelief. Children pointed and giggled, running alongside to get a better look. "Look, Papa," one cried. "They're carrying the donkey." The miller and his son, red-faced and exhausted, pressed on despite the mockery. "Ignore them," the miller muttered to his son, though his voice lacked conviction. "We're doing the right thing." But as they reached the middle of the bridge, disaster struck. One of the donkey's legs slipped from the miller's grip, causing the animal to panic. It kicked and brayed, thrashing wildly until it broke free. In the chaos, the donkey stumbled to the side of the bridge, losing its footing entirely. With a loud splash, it tumbled into the river below. The miller and his son rushed to the edge, horrified. Thankfully, the water was shallow, and the donkey quickly regained its footing, shaking itself off with an indignant snort. But their attempt to carry the animal had ended in utter humiliation. The crowd roared with laughter, their earlier criticisms forgotten in the face of such a comical spectacle. The miller and his son stood there, soaked in sweat and shame, realizing the futility of their efforts. As the donkey climbed back onto the river bank, none the worse for wear, the miller let out a long, weary sigh. "Let's go, my boy," he said quietly. "There's no pleasing everyone, no matter how hard we try." The boy nodded, his expression a mix of relief and sadness. Together, they led the donkey away from the jeering crowd, determined to finish their journey on their own terms. Chapter 4: The Lesson Learned. By the time the miller and his son arrived at the bustling marketplace, they were a peculiar sight indeed. Exhausted, disheveled, and dripping with sweat, they led their sturdy donkey into the square. Word of their antics on the road had traveled faster than they had, and a crowd quickly gathered, whispering, pointing, and giggling at the strange trio. The miller tried to ignore the stares, tugging the donkey's reins as they moved toward the market stalls. The boy followed closely, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and unease. He glanced nervously at the crowd, which had grown larger by the moment. "There they are," someone shouted. "The father and son who carried their donkey." Laughter erupted, loud and mocking, echoing off the cobblestone streets. The miller stiffened, clutching the reins more tightly. He had endured ridicule throughout the journey, but this public spectacle felt unbearable. His son tugged at his sleeve, whispering, "Father, can we leave? Everyone's laughing at us." The miller shook his head. "We've come this far, my boy. We need the money to buy what we need for the family. Let's sell the donkey quickly and go home." But their troubles were far from over. Startled by the noise and the jeering crowd, the donkey began to bray loudly, its ears flicking nervously. It stamped its hooves and pulled against the reins. "Easy, now," the miller murmured, trying to calm the animal. The laughter only grew louder, and some people began to shout taunts. "Maybe they should ride the donkey again, or carry it," one man called out, sending another wave of laughter through the crowd. The donkey, already agitated, suddenly reared up, yanking the reins from the miller's hands. It bolted forward, scattering onlookers as it ran wildly through the square. The boy cried out, and the miller sprinted after the animal, pushing through the crowd. "Stop it!" the miller shouted, his voice drowned out by the chaos. The frightened donkey charged toward the edge of the marketplace, where the river's edge bordered the square. The crowd gasped as the animal slipped on the wet stones, its hooves skidding. With a loud splash, the donkey tumbled into the water below. The miller and his son rushed to the river bank, their hearts sinking as they watched the donkey struggle against the current. Its braying echoed in the air, a sorrowful sound that matched the miller's dismay. The crowd, which had grown quiet for a moment, erupted into laughter once again. "What a disaster!" someone cried. "They've lost their donkey." The miller stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His son tugged on his sleeve, his young face pale and anxious. "Father, what do we do now?" The miller sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. He watched helplessly as the donkey, their means of income and the center of their entire journey, was swept downstream. There was nothing they could do to save it now. Finally, he turned to his son, his voice soft but firm. "Let this be a lesson, my boy. In trying to please everyone, we pleased no one, and lost what mattered most." The boy's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't want to lose the donkey," he whispered. "I just didn't want people to think badly of us." The miller placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I know," he said gently. "But life is full of people who will always have something to say, no matter what you do. We changed ourselves over and over to meet their expectations, and in the end, it brought us nothing but trouble." The boy looked up at his father, his expression a mix of sadness and understanding. "So, what should we have done, father?" "We should have stayed true to ourselves," the miller replied. "The world is full of voices, my boy, but not all of them deserve our attention. Sometimes, the best choice is the one that feels right in your heart, not the one that pleases the crowd." The pair began the long walk home, their steps heavy with disappointment, but also a new sense of clarity. The road seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly into the horizon. Yet as they walked in silence, their thoughts turned inward, reflecting on the valuable lesson they had learned. Though they had lost the donkey, they had gained something far more important: wisdom. The miller realized that he had been so caught up in others' opinions that he had forgotten to trust his own judgment. The boy, too, felt a newfound resolve blooming in his heart. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and gold, the father and son reached the edge of their village. The laughter and jeers from the marketplace were behind them now, replaced by the quiet hum of crickets and the distant murmur of the river. The boy spoke up, his voice steady. "Father, I understand now. We can't let everyone's opinions control us. It's impossible to please everyone, and we shouldn't try." The miller smiled, pride shining in his tired eyes. "You've learned a valuable lesson today, my boy. One that will serve you well as you grow." Hand in hand, they walked the final stretch home, their hearts lighter despite the loss they had endured. Though they returned empty-handed, they carried with them the strength of knowing that staying true to oneself was worth more than the approval of others. And so, their journey ended not with riches or success, but with a profound understanding of life's most important truth: the courage to follow one's own path, no matter how noisy the world may be.